All right, Karen, when you're ready.
Hey. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Ethan, the Executive Director of the Gulf Coast Consortia. Welcome to our panel discussion today. We're talking to some of our trainees who were in some of our training programs here at the Gulf Coast Consortia. And fortunately, we've had the privilege of keeping in touch with them over the 15 to so years that they have graduated from our training programs and moved on to careers in industry. And they are so gracious to come back and share some of their thoughts and ideas and experiences and challenges with you today so that you'll have a more clear idea of what it takes to get into industry, stay in there, stay in these jobs. How are these jobs different from jobs in academia? What are some of the challenges of working in industry? How do you find success? What is the work-life balance like if you have jobs in industry? This is to help all of you all determine if this is the right spot for you, and if so, how can you get your foot in the door? So we're going to start off by letting each of our 4 panelists introduce themselves, and then they'll also give about kind of a 5-minute overview of who they are, how they got to be where they are, and what they do. So that's going to take up about the first 20 minutes. Then we will go into some questions, and you may please feel free to help yourself to ask a question at any time during the presentations or discussions. We will be monitoring chat, so that's the way to ask a question. We'll be monitoring that, and hopefully we can get to all of your questions before we say goodbye at about 4:30 in about an hour and a half our time. So, all right, with no further ado, let's start with Cameron Brand.
Hey, sounds good. Thanks, Karen. Greatly appreciated. And hello, everyone, and happy to talk to you today on this either mid-afternoon or as it is for me, since I'm currently San Diego based, a little bit earlier in the afternoon, admittedly. So my background is actually, I am originally from Houston. For graduate work, I attended UT Health, same as many here. Got my PhD in cell and regulatory biology there with a concentration in pharmacology. So given that, it's probably not too surprising that the training program through Keck that I was working with at that time was the training in pharmacological sciences as well. And so given that, I think it's of note that in terms of skills, my background, particularly at that time, was very heavy on molecular biology, biochemistry, pharmacological binding, things of that nature. What I was studying at the time was a specific regulation of adenylyl cyclase, an enzyme that's involved in fight or flight responses. And what the training grant allowed me to do was look at particularly very drug development type projects and experiments that expanded my range and my viewpoint, essentially. So what that specifically allowed was for in silico design and screening in a high throughput nature of isoform selective molecular inhibitors, certainly something that's still of interest in the pharmaceutical area even today. So certainly some interesting times, even though it seems very close. It actually wasn't particularly recent, it's fair to say. So got that PhD, then ended up in San Diego for electing to take a postdoctoral fellowship. Excuse me. And so that was at the University of California, San Diego, where my intent was to gain a little bit more preclinical or translational experience as it relates to animal models. So worked more in cardiovascular pharmacology at that point briefly, still working on the molecular level with signal transduction and protein, specifically small g proteins at this particular stop, but learned quite a bit there as well. And again, for the drug development perspective, gained new skills and also gained a new viewpoint. From then, I made the jump into industry, still in San Diego, to my current position. So that's at a company called Abzena, Abzena. And what that is what's called a contracted development and manufacturing organization, or CDMO. So the work that I'm doing there is still using the skill set that I used in the laboratory at both the PhD and postdoctoral stops in terms of research and development. But more broadly speaking, how that works is that I'm functioning as a scientist there in an area, in a department for that matter, called process development, where we're working with clients on their biologics. So an antibody or some other molecular material similar to the ones that I was evaluating in the laboratory during my graduate career, but that they want to take these to clinical trial and they want to take them fairly quickly. These clients can be a wide range of groups and entities, but the general common thread is that they need another partner that they can work with for something that's lacking. Generally speaking, that's manufacturing infrastructure in an academic lab or a smaller startup, for example. You don't have the kind of scale for the biological equipment you need to make that antibody or other product in large amounts. So particularly the amount that you would need to go to a clinical trial for dozens, hundreds, thousands of patients and so forth. And so what I'm working on for process development is how do you get that function from a small amount to a large amount and still have that process be reproducible. So from a lab perspective, it's very heavy on methods and the reproducibility of those methods, so developing protocols as well. On the skills perspective, specifically within biology, what that means for what I'm doing is that I'm working in upstream development, or more specifically, the production of said antibody. Then there's subsequent steps known as, for example, downstream for the purification, making sure you get a official quality profile that you need before going into humans, things of that nature. And so it involves quite a lot of different functions that I guess we'll go into later, but it's interesting because some of the skills I used even in the early graduate stage, for example, microbial expression of the proteins that I was researching, in E. coli, for example, in shake flasks and things like that, that's now being done in larger scale industrial bioreactors or fermenters. And so it's still cell culture, but it's cell suspensions, whereas previously it might have been suspension or adherent. It's a difference between bacterial and microbial versus insectoid or even mammalian cells, and what their different regulatory levels are in order to express a given protein of interest. Or something that's even a little bit out of my initial training, which is the bioengineering aspect. How do you get the gas profile, the physical stresses on these cells to not be so much that they don't produce the antibody or other product you want? And so I think we'll talk about a little bit more later how that translates into what the day-to-day looks like, but I think that's a brief summary of what I do and how I got there. And so happy to see everyone today, or virtually see everyone today.
Okay, thanks so much, Cameron. Now we'll move on to Ana Maria Cárdenas.
Thank you. And thanks, Cameron, for starting us off. So I love the diversity that you all have on this panel because we're all doing so many different things. I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion. So yes, I am Ana Maria Cárdenas. I am originally from Bogota, Colombia. I came to the United States. I actually came to Galveston Island, and I did some lab work at UTMB before I joined my PhD program at Baylor College of Medicine. So I was a molecular virology and microbiology graduate of that program. And that's when I connected to the KIC, programs, which really allowed me to connect to different people and institutions in the medical center to get work done that I needed to do on my PhD that maybe didn't have the instruments that I had in the lab. And so I was like, all right, Rice has this, let me go to Rice. Okay, these people have this, let me go over there. And so it was a really great way to like build a network and get comfortable talking to people that maybe weren't in my field of study, but had the instruments that I needed to graduate. So that was great. After I finished my PhD at BCM, I was with Timothy Paulskill. I then went in to do a fellowship, and I did a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in clinical microbiology at the University of Pennsylvania. So this is an ASM, like CPEP approved fellowship, where you do 2 years of training. You then can get board certified if you pass the exam. And then this allows you to get training to be a laboratory director. So one of the things that I was very passionate about in my PhD studies, which was antimicrobial resistance mechanisms, I really wanted to have that impact to patient care. And so in thinking about my career, I was like, well, do I see myself in an academic institution doing research, or do I see myself more at the patient bedside, knowing that I didn't want to get an MD? And so this was a way to kind of marry both worlds in a sense of having that patient impact that I wanted, but also be able to continue to do some of the research and the interesting science that I really liked. And so I found this fellowship through someone at Texas Children's. So again, that network connection there, right? Super important. And I was 2 years at Penn. I graduated and then I became the infectious disease diagnostics laboratory director at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia with a faculty position at the University of Pennsylvania. So basically in that role, I was leading the infectious disease diagnostics lab. So if you can imagine any patient in the hospital that came in that was like, oh, maybe they have a bloodstream infection, or maybe they have a urinary tract infection, we would get the urine, we would get the blood, and we would analyze it and be able to report out if that person did have an infectious disease going on. I did stay there for about 7 years, and then we'll get on through this and I think the questions and the Q&As that we have, but decided to move to an industry role, mainly because I wanted to have that global impact. As I said at the beginning, I am from South America, and so I wanted to have more of an impact in the LATAM region. And I saw that through moving to industry, as well as more of a work life. I got married, I had a kid at this time. And so that changes a little bit your perspective and what you define as success. And so that led me to say, okay, time for something different. And that led me to Becton Dickinson, where I am today. So we moved from Philadelphia to Baltimore. So Galveston, Houston, Philly, Baltimore. And I started actually in the R&D function, and maybe something that we'll talk about today is thinking about what are functions in industry that you may be interested in, because I had no idea. Like industry was a black box, and it was like, oh, that job sounds cool. But really understanding what is R&D, what is quality, what is medical, what are all these different functions, how do they interact with each other, what makes it different, can help you understand to where you may be a better fit if you're thinking about a career in industry. So I started in the R&D function. I was there for almost 3 years, and then I actually moved to medical affairs. And I'm currently the senior director for global medical affairs at BD. BD is a 70,000 person company. So compared to Cameron's, it's a little bit different scale. And that's something that I think you'll also think about, right? As a smaller company versus a larger company, what speaks to you? There's different cultures, there's different things. So just thinking about that as well. We have a global presence. We have a medical side, an interventional side, and the life sciences side. And also I sit on the life sciences side. And I do a lot of infectious disease diagnostics. So applying what I learned in my training, both at BCM and also in my clinical training, and being able to bring that customer perspective in. As me as a lab director, how would I use these products? And being able to bring that and communicate that, working a lot with software engineers, mechanical engineers, other sorts of bioinformaticians as well, and being able to communicate the science piece of that, why it's important to our marketers, to our sales, etc. So hopefully we'll get a little bit more into that discussion, and you can see how all of these different functions interact. But that has been my journey And I think since we're going through alphabetical order, I think Alan is next.
I am, and I echo the sentiment about it being so great, the diversity of the panelists. I'm looking forward to our discussion later today. So the kind of the different hat that I bring is the regulatory hat. So I participated in the NanoBio training grant through GCC, GCC. And one of the things I really enjoyed about that was the co-mentorship and then the ability to network and meet people from the various institutions across the Texas Medical Center. So after I received my PhD in bioengineering, working in the nanobio area, I moved to also kind of the northeastern quadrant of the US, over to Silver Spring, Maryland, where the headquarters of FDA lies. And so I was at FDA for about 7 years, and it was a really wonderful experience as I got to take on many different types of roles in different offices in FDA and really gain an understanding of how FDA thinks about things, the processes, and just I think that perspective has been really valuable now that I'm in industry. So at FDA, I worked a while in the Office of the Center Director on policy and strategic priorities. Also served as a lead reviewer, reviewing medical device submissions that come in both in the pre-market and the post-market, working with manufacturers to negotiate and make sure that the evidence that was produced to support the safety and effectiveness of products was sound. And then after that, I went to this new office that we created at CDRH called the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation, and helped to build a program called the Patient Science Engagement Program. Also had the opportunity to work in creating other new programs and reviewer tools. And then also, unfortunately, the pandemic hit. And so during that time, I did a lot of kind of cross-agency work in terms of leading the review of emergency use authorizations and adapting that to changing conditions worldwide. And I really found that I really liked the global aspect also, kind of like Anna Maria, and so that's partly one of the reasons that I moved over to Johnson & Johnson, where now I have a global regulatory affairs role. And so what I do in my daily life or daily work? Daily work at J&J, I'd say that my goal is to help support my cross-functional partners, whether that's R&D, quality, marketing, to bring an idea, for example, a new product, to market and to markets across the world. And so a big part of that is a regulatory strategy and thinking about what is the most streamlined way that we can bring the product to the market. And so that has to do with maybe the regulatory pathway, which country we want to go to first, what are the evidentiary requirements? And so that all plays into when we're developing the product, what type of tests that we should do, that we should plan for, and so forth. And how can we engage health authorities like the FDA early on so that we can align on our approach and the evidence that we need to gather. So working biologics and devices right now on new product development, as well as after a product is on the market, we also want to ensure that it continues to stay compliant, right? Certain health authorities, you need to renew every certain number of years. Also, throughout the world, different health authorities have different requirements as to when you want to make a change in your product, such as a manufacturing change or a design change, if that triggers the need to submit a submission to FDA with data supporting that change. So hopefully that gives you a taste of my daily work, and I'd be happy to delve in more as we get into the questions. And I'll pass it now to Sarah.
Yep. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Dunlap. I was part of the GCC a while ago, the full 15 years ago, at least, 2005 to 2007-ish, I believe, as part of the pharmacogenomics program. So I got my PhD in neuro-oncology from MD Anderson in 2007, and I was focused on biomarkers of brain tumor progression, but that theme, okay, I did have a meandering career. But there is a theme of diagnostics and oncology that runs through it. I did then 2 postdocs, one, another postdoc at MD Anderson, and we were looking more at, because the blood-brain barrier is so broken down in brain tumors, what are the biomarkers present in the blood of brain tumor positive patients? And then I did a second postdoc, actually in cancer prevention at University of Texas, Austin. So I moved to Austin, and you know, what factors, especially in when we talk about diet and exercise, can help prevent cancer, especially for hormonally regulated tumors. Reducing your number of calories is one of the strongest ways you can work to prevent hormonally regulated tumors. Yes, I know this, and I still cannot resist the chips and queso. But there I did an AstraZeneca collaboration and almost did a postdoc at AstraZeneca. Probably wish I would have made that decision. But that would have been a third postdoc for me. And I just didn't feel at the time that that's where I wanted my life to get started. I felt like I was at that time, almost 30, and I really wanted to have a job and not do a third postdoc. But we'll talk about the benefits of a pharma postdoc if you are interested in moving to pharma. But I didn't do that. I instead decided to move to Luminex, which is an Austin-based, Texas-based diagnostics company. You may have a Luminex instrument in your lab. They're very inexpensive. They are very robust. They have a lot of research use applications. And I worked there for a while, like over 7 years, and I was able to kind of work my way through, because it was only a couple thousand people, through a lot of different roles. I started out in a lab-based role, being in charge of a laboratory. So I learned all of the process about how documentation is much different in industry versus in academia. I learned a lot about marketing, but my real home became clinical operations and regulatory. At the time, I was working on 510(k) regulatory clearances for infectious disease assays. But Alan can speak to, like, when you're submitting to the FDA in diagnostics, you learn a lot about the process in general. So my next job, I moved to Exact Sciences back in oncology, which is really where I wanted to be. It's in, it was kind of like the next step. I had worked previously in cancer prevention and diagnostics, and this is early detection of colorectal cancer. And I was there whenever we started expanding to other cancer types as well. They have, if you guys don't know, many of you are very young on here, they have the Cologuard assay, the at-home stool collection kit for testing for cancer for low or average risk people. And I got tons of different types of regulatory experience there, leading a huge ClinOps group, working with CROs, working with these contract research organizations. But through my network, I got a call from a former colleague of mine when I had done my second postdoc, and she was in the precision medicine and biosamples group here at AstraZeneca, and she poached me out of Exact Sciences, although it was very cold in Wisconsin, so I had moved to Madison. And I'm now in Maryland, which is hilarious that 3 of the panel members are in Maryland, and we did not plan that. So I moved now, and I live in Gaithersburg, Maryland, working for AstraZeneca. At first, I started in R&D, and I had spent my whole industry career in R&D doing the same sort of thing. Companion diagnostics, how do you bring a diagnostic through the R&D process and the clinical trials in synergy with our drug products? How do you best select for the responsive population for our cancer diagnostics so that you have that best risk-benefit ratio, right? Every cancer drug is going to have side effects, but you're only treating the people who really are going to respond. But then, I got pulled over here so now I'm working on the commercial side, and it literally might be my dream job. So global director, early detection and screening, but at a pharma company. And we don't make any diagnostics. So I get to look at early detection and screening, disruptive technologies. How does AI play in this space? How do these crazy ideas, where are we going to be in 10 years, and how is AstraZeneca preparing for that? And how are we creating equitable, I'm talking about all across the world, not just the US and countries that have a lot of money, but how are we getting cancer screening to sub-Saharan Africa, right? How are we getting cancer screening to everyone, so that we can have the best chance of curative intent? So it's a wonderful job, and I'm looking forward to all the questions. So I'll be quiet.
Thank you guys all so much. I can tell from some of the questions we have in chat that you have really hit upon some of the interests of this this group of people who have tuned into this call. Many of these questions have to do with some of the questions that we had discussed previously that we would address. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple of questions, and we will continue to monitor chat. So thank you very much. These are great questions, and I'm so glad that we've got the people we have on this panel, because I think you guys are really touching a nerve here. Okay, so, all right, Sarah, let's start with you with this question. So what are some of the skills that people should develop now so that they could transfer successfully from their academic training into a career in industry? And you might address that. In fact, all of you, when you maybe answer this question, address whether it's necessary to do a postdoc.
Well, I can already tell you, if you have a PhD, you have the skills to succeed in industry. I don't know. I mean, it depends on what sort of job, and I'm going to let somebody else talk about this, but it depends on what sort of job you want to get in industry. I can tell you, want to work in the lab in industry, you're ready to go. You're going to need to learn a little bit more about the documentation process and, learn the lingo. I don't want to undersell that. You do need to spend some time understanding what the acronyms are and what the R&D process is in industry. If you have any opportunity to understand, how do we bring assays or pharma products from an idea or a screening panel through analytical validation and clinical validation, and what those steps are, that would be great. That would be a great thing to learn. That's not something you're going to learn in a postdoc. The choices that you make are not the wrong choices. This is only one life. This is the life that you're living. You cannot go back and regret anything. If I had a crystal ball and I saw that I was going to be at a pharma company, 15 years later, I would have saved myself some time, probably by just going straight to an industry postdoc. An industry postdoc, especially at a pharmaceutical company, is a great way to get a guaranteed job and get your foot in the door. They're relatively difficult to get, but and they pay like a regular postdoc, but I think it's a good transition. And it's a low risk way of trying out industry. I'm going to be quiet. I could talk forever, so I'm going to let somebody else talk and see what somebody else has to say.
Yeah, I can chime in then. I think for me, it wasn't necessarily that a postdoc was needed for the industry position. It was that it gave me the needed director of an infectious disease lab option to then go into an industry role. So I think even though it wasn't needed for the industry role, it was the path that I needed to take to get me to that next step. Similar to Sarah, though, if you would have asked me in grad school, oh, are you going to be working in industry? I'd be able to like, no, so sometimes it's hard. Also, like you're not really planning 10 years ahead because you don't know where you're going to be. But I do agree that the choice that you make is the right choice. It's one life. That's you just have to know that that's true. I think it also may depend on what you want to do in the industry setting. If you're going into an R&D role, I fully agree with Sarah. I think with a PhD, you're more than capable of doing an R&D role. And if you want to be an individual contributor versus if you want to be a manager, do you want to be leading a team? Maybe you need some different skill sets than if you want to be on the bench doing, rolling up your sleeves and doing kind of that sort of work. So just things to consider, one or the other, but I would say no, it's not necessarily, there's not a clear, oh, if you don't have a postdoc, you're not going to make it into industry. Absolutely not.
Yeah, I'll add on to that a little bit, I think, as well, in that, so to give some perspective on my particular areas, probably the closest peer I have in terms of a scientist at the company I'm currently at does not only not have a postdoc, does not have a PhD, does not have a master's. Much older than me and has much more experience with the equipment we work with. So there's a lot of different ways to get to the same point, and the PhD as well as a postdoc can get you a lot of different advantages. But you don't really, I think, want to shortchange the skills you get at PhD and or postdoc stops. It's not just, even if you're in R&D, it's not just the skills you're learning in the lab with the laboratory techniques, but it is the soft skills. That will also separate PhDs from each other in a very significant way. Can you make your details for what you're working on very clear in a short period of time, particularly to people that don't have a scientific background? That's probably a good example of, even though I'm still in the lab for a couple of hours each day, something that's an absolutely essential skill set. And you can learn that at PhD, you can learn that at postdoc. So the postdoc isn't required, but you do want to know either from specific equipment skills or even from soft skills what you want to get out of it. And that'll kind of determine the path you want to take. Also, to agree with both Anna and Sarah, there's only one life, and also no decisions are final. I know some people do tend to apply pressure on themselves. Even though you can't change past decisions that you take in terms of your career path, certainly none of them close any doors completely. It just kind of changes the path, so to speak. And that really goes for any of the different industry stuff we're probably describing over the next hour or so left.
Yeah, I have to agree. I think that with all of our paths, I've noticed that the whatever post PhD graduation work has really helped inform the later steps, and maybe even prepared and made the case better for some of the subsequent steps. Strictly speaking about, for example, going into FDA or going to J&J, I don't think a postdoc is necessary at all to go into a job at FDA. And likewise, for most of my colleagues in R&D or quality and so forth, many of them don't necessarily even have a PhD. So I'd say postdoc is not necessary.
Okay, well, I think you guys have answered certainly a lot of questions that we've had come in just recently about doing a postdoc. So another question that came in that is in kind of line with some of the questions that we had discussed is, gosh, there's so many jobs to choose from in industry. How do you know which one to go for? And how do you make your skills stand out for that particular position when, maybe it's not a perfect fit? Who wants to go first? Alan?
Well, I was wondering if we could kind of poll the audience to better understand PhD backgrounds. I guess what percentage of folks are like very bioscience related versus bioengineering related? That will help me, because I think my path is a little bit more medical device, and so it might be maybe a little different from the pharma. Oh, but then again, Anna Maria and Sarah, like in vitro diagnostics, never mind. But I think it might still be informative to the panel, right? To better understand backgrounds. Do we have any sense of the
I don't think we have collected that information. I don't know if we could do a survey real quick just to, to find out. We were not prepared to do
I'm
that.
sorry.
Yeah, I can do a
All right.
quick poll. Tell me again what are the two areas you want to find out?
Maybe pharma versus biomedical engineering.
Okay.
What do the panelists think?
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, why you guys like pull it? Look, I was a hiring manager for, I don't want to, God, it's been a long time, like 10 years, right, in industry. I hired a lot of people straight out of postdocs and PhDs. You guys are wanting to know like how to get your foot in the door, right? So you have to, find a job description of a job that you think is interesting. And I'm trying to look through, I have some decks that I created that sort of show the product development process so that you guys can at least see like the titles of some jobs that might be interesting. But when you find a job description of a job that you want, people in industry are looking for every single bullet point on that job description, just to let you know. Like, that is very serious. We have curated exactly what we need from that job, and we are frankly not always looking for somebody who could do the job. We're looking for somebody who has already done the job, right? So the best thing that you can do is, this is my ideal job description and this is where my CV is at. Like, what are the skills that I am missing in order to get this job? And maybe start working on them now and take like a really scientific approach to it. You can start to tailor your CV and your resume to more of an industry style. And you can start to see, like, start trying to get, don't do any cold applying. Like, who at that company do I know that I could call that could give me an internal recommendation? Start utilizing your networking contacts. The job market is in industry is always really like competitive. And so you're gonna need to put yourself at an advantage, whether it be location wise, whether it be having the perfect CV that matches up with the job description, whether it be already knowing somebody in the company that can give you a foot in the door, right? A cold apply through LinkedIn job applications is probably not going to get you a call back. And so think about how you can best utilize your time and match up your CV with the job description. Okay, but then we can go to the poll.
Okay, you answered about 4 or 5 questions just with that answer. Thank you so much. All right, Cameron, Alan, Anna Maria, anybody else want to contribute to that answer?
Yeah, sure. Oh, go ahead, Alan.
Oh, no,
go
no,
ahead.
No, you go
I
ahead,
was-
please.
Or Cameron, go. Okay.
I'll let one of y'all take it.
All right, I will start then. So one of the things that, because I do get asked that question a lot, like, how do I know where to even begin to look at jobs in industry or what? And so many times, take a look at what companies you're already interacting with in the lab. What people go in and out of your lab for companies all the time to work on the instruments, to do things. So you can start to get a sense for what companies are in the areas that you are working on or you may be interested in. Like Sarah was saying, she was looking for like maybe oncology as her next, so she was probably looking at companies that did oncology work. And so let that guide you. If you're interested in infectious diseases, there are certain companies that are focused on that. So that can at least give you a starting point to say, all right, why don't I just go to the website, and they all have a jobs.com page, right? Whatever it may be. And many of them have filters. So you can filter by functions like R&D, quality, medical, and you may not know what those mean, but you can start filtering and just say, all right, let me look at and let me read some R&D job descriptions. And you start to get an idea of, all right, do these sound really boring? Or do they actually have certain things, and you can even highlight them, get your notes, whatever, saying, hey, these are things that are actually sound really interesting. And you can do that with a couple of the functions, medical, quality, regulatory, and you can start to build like a picture saying, hey, I'm leaning towards more of these medical descriptions because of X, Y, or Z, or of these regulatory because of X, Y, or Z. And that starts to give you a better understanding, because you may not know someone at a company, or you may not know, to at least start to say, okay, where do I need to go to then go to where Sarah was saying and saying, where is your CV and where is, the job that you really liked, and start to compare and contrast and say, what do I need to get out of that? So that's a way to start. I mean, exploring. And also, like, if there are people that are coming into your lab to do work on an instrument, talk to them. Hey, how's it work? How does it, what do you do in this company? So and so. I mean, you can get a very interesting reply and start to get a better idea of what that is, in addition to everything that Sarah said about using your networked, trying to get that foot in the door, et cetera, et cetera. Just wanted to add.
That's a great idea. And just to add on to that, the reason that I was asking about biomedical engineering versus pharma is because, I guess from my lens with medical device companies, I see the various functions are things like marketing, quality, medical, clinical, regulatory. And I wasn't sure if that was exactly going to be the case with pharma as well, but in that context, if y'all are interested in kind of medical device companies, what I've heard is that it really doesn't matter like which function you come in at, people move around. I don't see that movement very often, but I often, for example, see people who did quality for some time and then moved into regulatory as an example. So just want to share that it's possible that it may not matter that much, but I think I would choose something that you are interested in, and then just know that there's a possibility to move in the future. And then you might just, for example, after following what Ana Maria was talking about in terms of looking at job descriptions and filtering, perhaps you can reach out to folks with that function in LinkedIn and talk with them and better understand what is it exactly, what does it entail doing quality at a company.
Yep. And I think those are great points. I think another one, at least, it was difficult, at least early on for me, particularly because I am more inclined towards the introverted side, but do not have any aversion or shame whatsoever on leveraging your network at any point. Anyone that you know from the lab, and I think it goes to even people working on the equipment in the lab, for example. Don't be afraid just to get just some information, essentially, because certainly you can be asked for that in the future as well. There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever.
Okay, all right, let's move on to another question. That has been so very insightful. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you for all of these wonderful questions. So let's kind of look at transitioning from academia to industry. You know, what are the differences between working in academia and working in industry? And if you could also touch on those work-life differences, because that's something that every single person, whether, no matter where you are, your gender, whether you've got kids or not, we are these days, fortunately, people are really interested in work-life balance. So talk about all of that if you could. Okay, Cameron, why don't we go back to you?
Yeah, and so certainly I think we're at different points on the panel for that as well. So with work-life balance, it's certainly different from what I had in the academic setting. Admittedly, part of that, and everyone is different, but for me, at least at the PhD and to a lesser extent at the postdoc stage, it wasn't that difficult. There weren't as many life pressures, let's put it that way, to maintain work-life balance. Certainly, so for example, on a personal note, I got married last year. She also works in academia, actually, and so there's all of these different priorities that now come into play over the last few years since we met each other that I didn't really have when trying to maintain work-life balance in a PhD program. Certainly, the more of those you have, they're very rewarding, and at the same time, they kind of change that equation a little bit in terms of how to establish work-life balance. That being said, comparing, say, the postdoc to what I do in industry a lot more directly, the industry job that I have, because it is still industry research and development, it's definitely higher stress on a day-to-day basis than what I was doing in an academic postdoc. That being said, personally, I find the work I'm doing more rewarding, so it tends to balance that out. It's also much shorter hours in industry than I was working. It's not the probably 60 hours a week in a lab that I was doing pretty consistently. There's just a lot more packed into a 40-ish hour work week. And so I guess the way you could describe it is that the tolerance for something like that is going to change from person to person. But if you thrive in high stress atmospheres, that's actually better for someone like myself. And so certainly it's better in that respect to maintain a work-life balance. But definitely even within industry, depending on the kind of job you have and whether it's a high stress or let's call it medium stress situation, how you maintain work-life balance will change dramatically.
So Sarah, I think you just something.
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I know you also have some really great insights around this. I want to encourage people to think about their intrinsic reward system. So in academia, you're going to get a lot of reward and fulfillment by doing experiments every day, to mentoring, to teaching, to writing, and whether that be like seeking out grants, to really taking ideas potentially start to finish and nurturing these things. When you come to industry, it doesn't have to be high stress. I mean, the value system is totally different. So now you're working on what are the business priorities, what are the scorecards, how am I delivering to my KPIs, and how am I moving projects forward, how am I fast failing, if that sounds exciting to you, right? Like, how do I create better market access um for my drugs, or like how do I get more patients access to my diagnostics? The words that I'm saying are much different, right? If you feel like you're going to miss writing and teaching, it's not that you can't move to industry, but I personally have had to seek out other opportunities to help support and nurture my own intrinsic reward system, right, in order to make sure that my life is balanced. Be thinking about those changes, and I don't want to discount them. That first year that you move into industry can be a little bit jarring whenever as you readjust yourself. But here's the deal, I'm going to say it out loud. They pay us more in industry. And so for what you're missing in academia, you get the opportunity to take your family on vacation, not a vacation linked to a speaking opportunity, but like, I have found that I get less days off in industry because I was able to take off time in accordance like with the schedule. So I would take almost a month off in December. Like, we can't do that anymore. But that I get the opportunity to now I travel internationally for work. So, there's rewards on both sides, but it also has to do with recognizing what you need in yourself, and then also how do you access what you need no matter what you choose to do. So
Great points. So I just want to really briefly state that my experience across academia, government, and industry has been that for me, it's been quite similar work-life balance. But I think what I've also noticed is that you can't exactly just say, for example, Johnson & Johnson has great work-life balance. It really varies based on the business unit or even the team. The culture, it's like microcosms. And so when you're looking for a role, it's important to better understand that team, the hiring manager, because the hiring manager, of course, will set the tone for work-life balance as well.
And to add to what all my other panelists have said, I think one thing that is more often than not overlooked is your own ability to set boundaries. So I think that's very important. Where are you communicating with people and saying, look, I need to go pick up my kid at 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock or whatever. I'm not going to be available from 4 to 5. And that's just a given. And being able to set that expectation. Now, is it going to work every single week and every single day? And when there's a fire, going to be able, maybe not, likely not, but at least being able to set those boundaries and able to communicate those, I think is also important. And so you need to be self-aware to say, what are my boundaries? Where do I need to have this and not? I think every one of us in industry has worked a weekend here or there for sure. I would guarantee you that. But it's also knowing, okay, yeah, I need to fit this in because this is important, but I'm not going to be working every single weekend, 9 to 5. That's not an expectation. And so thinking about that too. And I would say that's important for any role you're in, not just in industry, also in academia, setting those boundaries, knowing what works and what doesn't work. In my case, when I was working in the laboratory, I was on call 6 months out of the year. I had a baby at that time. And while I was cleaning, washing my son or giving him a bath, the pager would go off and I'd be yelling for my husband across the house, hey, get the kid, because I need to answer the call. And it was okay for some time, but at some time I also was like, all right, this is enough. I need something needs to change in my life. I don't want this for me, for my family. And that also led me to make some other decisions and some choices that needed to be made. So just remember that you have some empowerment, and empower yourselves to set boundaries within what you want to accomplish as well. In addition to, of course, some things are the culture of your company and your team, et cetera, et cetera. But just remember that you need to have some control there as well.
All right, thank you guys again. So kind of going back to the culture of your organization, how do you feel like the culture of your organization impacts your career growth, your promotions, helps you get what you determined to be the definition of success, and especially an organization in which there's a lot of, say, adversarial positions or toxicity or something like that? How do you navigate through those different cultures? And how do you know if that company even has a culture that's gonna, fit in with you or not fit in with you? Anyone?
It's an important question, Karen. At least personally, I'm trying to think of how to answer it because it's really critical. Anyone else feel free to jump in because I'm probably gonna let my thoughts ramble at least to keep things moving, at least at first. On the toxicity side, it's always hindsight is 2020 and everyone's individual experiences are different. But at least when it comes to specifically toxic individuals, I not only did I have to navigate a little bit more of that in academia than I did in industry, at least at my current stop, but in a story we don't really have time for, that was actually part of the selling point for why I was recommended for my current industry position. And again, it goes back to soft skills and things like that. Now, in terms of identifying a toxic workplace environment, I think pay close attention to who's interviewing you and the kinds of questions they're saying too. Is it one-on-one interviews? Do you get just kind of higher ups interviewing you, or also kind of the peers you'd be working with, I think are other examples. And just kind of get an idea, are they showing you, if it's an R&D type position, are they showing you the laboratory area? Are they keeping tight-lipped about kind of what they actually do from day to day? Certainly there's proprietary information complications with that, so that's no one's just going to show you everything all at once in industry. But you can kind of get an idea on, are people protecting their intellectual property, or are they trying to hide toxic environment, basically? There's no clear-cut way to do it, but certainly it's, if you look for signs, then kind of trust your gut instinct, I guess, is the best policy.
Yeah, I mean, Glassdoor is a really great place to start. But if you know somebody at the company, or you know somebody who had a Keck fellowship, who worked at the company that you worked at, it's a great place to start. Say like, hey, we were in school together. I saw you worked at this company. I want nothing more than just like an unapologetic review, And a lot of times people are willing to give you those insights, especially if they're already gone. Or if they've been there 15 years, I mean, that's probably a good sign. I also felt like academia was a little bit, of course, this is also like so long ago. I really feel like people hopefully have become less toxic as people have become more aware. There is like no HR in academia, and in industry, people are not allowed to just be like horrible to each other. I actually have had a really great experience in industry. We have calculated metrics about how diverse our workforce is, how many women are in leadership positions. And I have sought out AstraZeneca as a company because of the massive amount of women at the SVP level. And so I'm able to, because we're publicly traded, I'm able to go and see what the metrics are and see who my leaders are and talk to them. So I actually have had a really good experience in industry and felt really protected and really safe throughout my career, and really heard. And And that has caused me to work really hard and get promoted, you know, so I have nothing but good things to say, honestly.
I'll skip out on this one because I think Cameron and Sarah did a really great job covering everything.
Same.
Okay, all right, great. All right, now another specific question. If someone has a PhD plus another degree, say an MBA or an MD, and they want to get into industry, do they have to start at the bottom when they feel like they have just tons of experience? You know, how can someone with a lot of experience and other degrees get into industry? What should they expect?
I can share a little bit. I mean, I don't have an MD or an MBA, but but when I was transitioning, I went from a director of a clinical lab and faculty at a university to a senior manager role. I had no idea if that was bottom, middle, high. I had absolutely no clue. I'm just, a lot of people these days are much more prepared than I was when I moved into industry. But I was more interested in, is the job description and what I'm going to be doing something that will get me out of bed than the title? And honestly, I didn't get much of a different pay moving from academia in my lab director job to industry. I did not get like a huge bump. It was pretty much on par. So I saw it as something needs to change. I'm looking for opportunities. This is something that really excites me, rather than where in the tier am I going to land? And because I think one of the reasons, and this is looking back, is also industry, there are so many opportunities to move, both laterally, up, sideways, back way. I mean, there's so many opportunities. And so even though you may start at a level that you weren't thinking you were going to start at, the opportunities for movement are enormous. And so if you work hard, if you prove yourself, et cetera, if there's opportunities, like that will come. And so I would just encourage you to look further out than just the next step, especially if you're moving to industry. And I say that not just for one company, but once you're in industry, you can shift companies as well. And so again, there's a very large realm of opportunities there too. And a title in one company may not be the same title, position, whatever in another company. So looking at jobs and titles really doesn't tell you much in the end. It's really more about, are you going to get out of bed for doing what the job entails in your interviews, rather than really looking at that. And then are you willing to maybe get a little bit more pay, maybe the same, depends on your own situation.
Anyone else? Ellen, Cameron, Sarah, you want to add to that?
I totally agree. Like I entered as a manager. What does it even mean? Yeah, right. Sure. I had been two postdocs and I had managed lots of people. I also thought I knew what I was doing, and I did not. And I needed to spend like 2 years figuring out what it meant to be in industry and what skills were transferable, what did I need to learn. And I'm honestly glad I didn't end up with a big lab director role in industry. I would have been totally underwater. I entered in at exactly the right position for me. I thought the interview process was super fair. And after I proved myself and learned everything I needed to learn, I quickly got promoted to senior manager because I did need to fill those gaps. So I honestly thought it was fair. That being said, I can think off the top of my head probably 3 or 4 MDs or MD PhDs that have entered industry at AstraZeneca at a very, very high level, but they were industry leaders before they came to AstraZeneca. So you need to ask yourself, are you an industry leader? Are you someone that the industry looks to as a thought leader? Are you already doing paid speaking engagements from these companies? Are you already an ambassador of the science? Do you already speak regularly on these topics at huge congresses? If so, you are ready to make a switch at a quote unquote high level. And those people are often very successful and come in at a strategy level because they're already doing strategy. But if you're like me and you had 2 postdocs, super smart, ran a lab, yes, okay. I mean, you have to be realistic also about the gaps that you have when you make the jump. We all had them. So anyway.
Yeah, and I think this touches on what we were talking about earlier in that you don't necessarily need a postdoc to make the jump to industry, but it shouldn't go without notice that a lot of what we've done postdocs, to be honest. So it's not like it's a fatal bullet or anything either. And I think going along hand in hand with that, I saw kind of as the questions are popping up in the chat, this also goes kind of with the volatility, I guess you could say, in industry, is that people are used to jumping from place to place. I saw that there was mention of there's quite a few large companies that have layoffs. Industry, particularly in the research side, is notorious for having these huge hiring cycles followed a couple of years later by huge layoff cycles, at which talent is kind of released into the area, then basically goes different places. Especially at clusters, I think it's no coincidence that we're all in the panel based in either California or Maryland. And to be fair, those things are changing a little bit. I know we have clients that, for example, are in the Texas area, although I can't disclose who. One of our larger competitors, as far as a much larger company than ours, Lonza, has a plant in Pearland that doesn't directly do what we do, but that would still be considered a competitor, basically. So it is spreading out more nationally as well as globally as well. But it's not just that. You definitely have the opportunity to jump from place to place in terms of laterally, but sometimes it's just simply required, and it's not necessarily your degrees that travel with you, it's the skills you got during those training periods.
And then just to add on my perspective regarding the MD, PhD, or MBA portion, I was trying to think through my colleagues at FDA and J&J, and most of the MDs, there's a whole bunch of MDs at FDA, but most of them, I think they had practiced for many years before joining FDA and were kind of later in their career. So, and then also MBA, there are MBA folks like ours. I knew some reviewers who also had a PhD and MBA. Didn't make that big of a difference as a reviewer, but I have seen it perhaps in some roles at FDA and J&J, it may have helped them get into a manager role. But I think that there's plenty of people without MBAs who got into a manager role as well. And then similarly regarding the MD at J&J, most of them have been kind of more senior level and kind of worked their way up from maybe their R&D position up into medical affairs.
And I think that you kind of made me remember what I wanted to add there. So everyone's case is there, and it depends on your starting spot as well. So I think that where I am in industry has been a particularly rapid progression. It's been pretty standard for what I've seen. So the PhD and postdoc didn't really kind of make that take off as much as it was the work that I did when I started here. That being said, because I was in the middle of a first academic postdoc, especially living in California and the cost of living demands, the salary jump was both enormous and appreciated greatly when I jumped industry. Those things are under competition between other companies within the cluster within San Diego as well. So it can be where you start off career-wise, salary-wise. There's a lot of variance there.
So do you guys have any thoughts on startups? I don't know that any of you guys worked in any startups before you moved into, say, big pharma or FDA, but do you have any insight into the layoffs that we've seen and read about in startups versus, you know, seasoned pharmaceutical companies? Alex?
Yeah. So, I mean, layoffs are, I mean, that's a part of life. You know, people lose grants, and people also have to change jobs because grants are lost. So nobody is really immune to layoffs. That being said, if you co-localize yourself to one of these hubs, you're on the East Coast near Boston, you're in Maryland near NIH, you're Southern California, Northern California, The opportunities are absolutely endless. I think that startups are an incredible place to, you want to wear many hats, you want to work hard, play hard. Those are not things I want to do. But if that's what you want to do, then is a great place for an early career person who maybe does not have a small child. You can do things like trades, get equity in a company that's not public, and literally if the company is successful or gets sold, you could be a millionaire, right? I mean, these are high risk, high potential payoff jobs. And if you've co-localized yourself where there's also lots of other startups, your skills are immediately transferable. You will immediately get picked up by somebody else who wants you to work really hard. I think the bigger the company, the more redundancy of effort and the more redundancy of knowledge base. So I've worked at mid-sized biotech companies, and as I've transitioned to a very large pharma, I can tell you it is much easier for me to go on vacation. It is much easier for me to leave at I work on a European, so most of my colleagues are European. So I work at from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. every day. And then I go get my son, right? And I go hang out with him, and I prioritize that because the company is much bigger, and it has its own hurdles, and it has its own like bureaucracy kind of stuff, but at least I don't feel like I need to get a ton of stuff done every single day like you would in a startup. Okay, that's kind of rambling, but hopefully you got what I'm saying.
Other thoughts from Anna, Ellen, Cameron?
Yeah, I think I was about to say something similar to the first portion of what Sarah was saying in terms of the kind of the opportunities of startups. But I think to add on to that, I think another factor to consider is the quality of the startup also. So does the startup kind of know what they're doing, so that during the process, as you're gaining that experience, you're learning the right way of doing things. I think some startups are so early and may not have the people with experience, where in that case, maybe it wouldn't be as good of an idea. But if it's a pretty promising startup and you have that opportunity to gain a lot of experience, I think there could be a lot of value there.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone else has said. I think it's, yeah, more thinking about what are you interested in? Do you want to be, in the hot seat doing 10 different jobs because you're the one and only, or not? And I think also like your family situation, your personal situation, right? For me, my husband was the one that went into the startup, and I was the one that went into the larger company. And we just kind of had that conversation, and we were okay having a little bit more risk on one partner than on the other, even though, yes, none of our jobs are guaranteed, but taking a look at that too and seeing what does your personal situation look like as well. Are you willing to move, like Sarah said, to one of the high, movement places, even though California is more expensive, right, than other parts in the country? So give or take, every decision is a give or take, and just kind of thinking about what your priorities are and what you're willing to risk.
Yeah, agreed. And there's definitely a gradient to it as well, where with startups, admittedly, again, can't mention names, but a lot of our clients, the vast majority are startups because you just don't have the same infrastructure, less people than, say, a Johnson & Johnson for getting something from early hit to lead to all the way to clinical. It just takes so much capital and so many people that a startup is going to need different supports along the way. And that's basically my company's business advantage, is identifying what risks the client has and seeing how we can help them out. Can we get them to clinical trials faster? For the research lab area, if we can get their product produced at a gram per liter higher, that's millions of dollars they save on having to do those runs and more clinical work that they can do. There's also the regulatory support as kind of a mid-sized company that we provide. So that's been an area where I've gotten to kind of add a hat, so to speak, but it's regulatory support from a couple of more research scientists that are on the senior side. It's in no way, shape, or comparison, to be blunt, even comes close to comparing to the expertise and ability of Alan and his group. Even without knowing more about them, I can tell you without a doubt, it's just not the same. But you work with those types of hats, even at a mid-sized group, and then obviously as it's larger companies, you get less and less of that, and it's much more matrixed, as Sarah described so well.
Okay, speaking of regulatory affairs, we have a question. Alan, maybe you could answer this one. Or if you know specifically that you have a specific job in mind, but you don't have, and you'd love to do that job, but you really don't have any experience or expertise in that job. Anna, this may touch on something that you went through as well. So how do you get that expertise so that you can put yourself in a position to acquire that kind of job? In this case, someone asked a question about regulatory affairs. How do they learn about that so they can apply for a job in that field?
Well, that's a really good question, because I think no matter where in our career, oftentimes we encounter this situation where we're interested in a job, but then we might not have the experience in that job, right? So I may not have the most comprehensive insight on this yet, so I can just share with you what I've seen, for example, at FDA or in J&J, in terms of people without experience, how they got a role at FDA or J&J. I think at least when I was at FDA, it may have changed. I think it may be about the same now, but it may be a little bit more competitive to get into FDA now, because a lot of the roles are remote. But prior to that, I did see quite a number of people be able to go from academia into FDA regulatory without prior regulatory experience, because that scientific mindset was kind of what was most important. Although with the federal resume process, it was really strict in terms of having had demonstrated that experience. So it'd be really tricky, but you would have to basically take your lab experience and write it in a way that really matched what the FDA, the federal resume application was looking for. At J&J, I've seen some folks come from academia into regulatory affairs roles. I think without the experience, I've seen them start very entry level. Someone recently joined our regulatory affairs team who's a little higher, like regulatory affairs 3, and had been kind of a assistant professor-ish person, but was able to talk about managing projects and other things that were translatable to regulatory affairs. And then I think it's helpful that one person I just talked about, she spoke with like 100 people in regulatory affairs during her course of applying, and 20 within our organization. And so I think that may also have helped her.
Well, so what about contract research organizations, CROs, that offer these kinds of services, regulatory affairs, and how to understand the clinical trial process? What about, would that be a good entry level job to kind of get some experience so you could move into big pharma?
I think that could be. I was on the Rice BioE career panel on Tuesday. I think it was on Tuesday or Monday. It was this week. And the other panelist works at one of the CROs, and that's exactly what she did after her master's. She went entry level in regulatory affairs, and just within a short time span, she's ascended up, been part of like 60-something product development. And so I think being part of, as a consultant, you have exposure and quickly gain your experience. So I think that's another good pathway. The FDA pathway is also really good. Because as a FDA reviewer, you definitely learn the regulatory on the job. And I think 1 year at FDA is equivalent to maybe 5 to 8 years in industry in terms of that exposure, that you see all the different types of submissions. So you get that mindset. And so it's, to me, it's equivalent to maybe an industry where you're a regulatory affairs professional and you might just work on a certain number of submissions for like 1 or 2 products, right? That's the difference. So I think that could be the CRO, FDA could both be good experiences, or just jumping into industry.
Anyone else?
I'm sorry, Karen.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Cameron.
I was just gonna say there's a significant overlap between CROs and CDMOs, so I think that that's a fair point. It's not completely dissimilar from kind of the current situation I see. So I haven't talked about it much since it's not super relevant, but it is an international company I work for. So in addition to the San Diego site, which is about 1 to 200 people, you have an approximately similarly sized site near Philadelphia and another one that does more of the early stage work and cell line development in England. That one is pretty much functioning as a CRO, and you do see similar opportunities, at least from what I've seen anecdotally.
Okay, so we have an interesting question, and I think this is a personal answer. What and we'll start with Sarah, and then Anna, and then Alan, and then Cameron. So what were your personal priorities in choosing the job that you now have in industry? Was it work-life balance? Was it salary? Was it position? Was it the culture of the company? Was it the location? What was your own personal priority in actually taking the job that you now have? Okay, so who did I say would start with? Sarah?
Oh, the job I have now. I mean, I'm trying to think about like the very first job. Who knows how I got how I like total luck is how I've gotten here. Who knows? But at the very beginning though, like what were my priorities the day that I decided to like leave industry? I was actually interviewing for tenure track positions. I received 2 tenure track offers, but both came with I had to cover 100% of my overhead, and I was going to be entering like where I was in somebody else's lab. It was basically a glorified postdoc, but technically I was going to be a professor. It was really tough. It was going to be really tough to succeed. I was going to have to cover, if you know what that means, I have to cover 100% of my overhead with grants. It was going to be extremely competitive, and I was going to come back up again for, it wasn't a full tenure offer, right? I was going to get reviewed every 5 years. And they were both outside of Texas. And I also interviewed with Luminex, and Luminex was in Austin, and I was in Austin. I was already there, and my family lives in Texas. And for me, at that time in my life, prioritizing living near my family was number one. So location really played a huge role. And when I put all 3 offers on the table, the industry offer was literally double that of the 2 professor offers. So I got to stay close to my family, and the salary was more. At the time, I did not know where this was going to take me, right? I did not really know. I entered kind of naively into industry. I didn't know a ton of people. I knew that I had worked with the equipment, right? And I knew what I was doing in the lab, but beyond that, I wasn't really sure. As my career progressed, though, I made very purposeful decisions. So at Luminex, I was working more in infectious disease, but I really, in my heart, wanted to get back to cancer. I wanted to get back to cancer research. And so I purposely made the move to Exact Sciences, and then also into AstraZeneca, into a bigger organization where I'd have more flexibility with my schedule, right? So and once I got into industry and I sort of saw the landscape, I made really purposeful decisions. I wanted to be close to patients. I wanted to impact patients. I wanted to impact patients globally. I wanted to make sure that we had an equity focus. And so those are the things I get to do now. But it started with some really like basic life decisions. So, Anna Maria, I'm gonna let you go now.
Yeah, so for me it was similar. I was moving from assistant to associate professor at the time, and so I was putting all my paperwork to get promoted. And it was asking myself, okay, what are my next 5 years going to look like? And it was like, I'm still going to be teaching 200 hours a year. I'm still going to be, like maybe doing some of the research, but it wasn't a huge change. The salary was going to go up a little bit. But it was really about, am I going to get someone else to help with the clinical support? We had these discussions, and it doesn't seem like that was going anywhere. So again, it was more of that, like, I don't want to be on call half the year. And so I literally moved the little LinkedIn button that says like you move it to the right, I think, and it's like it's open to opportunities, but you're not putting the whole green thing on your face. It just kind of think it tells like recruiters and others like, hey, this person is interested and maybe available. So I literally did that. At the same time, my husband was finishing up his time as a postdoc. He had done a couple of years in a bioinformatician position. And again, he was like, hey, I'm ready to move elsewhere as well. So it was kind of like, all right, let's take a look at what opportunities there are. We moved from Philadelphia to Baltimore for the industry job. So we have no family in either place. So it wasn't a big deal for us to do that, even though it's only an hour and a half away. It still was a big move. But I think also the opportunity that I saw in industry for that global impact, for what I was going to be doing day to day, were one of the things that definitely made me move. Like I said, my salary was basically the same, so that didn't have an impact. In terms of being in industry, I've had 3 different roles at BD. And so to Sarah's point, I've been very kind of specific on what my steps have been. Starting in R&D over a specific platform to a broader R&D role, looking at multiple platforms, to now moving to medical affairs, which got me back to that customer connection and all that I wanted to do. So again, you never know where the path will lead, but I think if you are able to communicate where you want to go, use your network, etc., you can make that happen in an industry setting. Yeah. I can't remember who you said was next, Alan or Cameron.
Ellen, you go. Okay.
Oh, okay. I was pointing to Cameron, but okay, I'll go. I think that for me, I prioritize interest area, kind of where I want to go. And so for my example, for J&J, I was interested in the global aspect, and J&J has such a far reach. A lot of companies actually go to J&J because they have all those connections, and that's a good platform for bringing products to different markets. And I wanted kind of the industry perspective after having been in government. So when I was making that transition, I prioritized being at a company that was well established and global, had a good culture. J&J has this credo that's really focused on all stakeholders. And then finally, to me, it's also important to have a good team culture. And I got that taste from the interview.
Yeah, and so there were some complexities, I guess you could say, in my case. I knew that I wanted to stick in the lab, at least in some capacity, coming out of the PhD, which is what brought me into the postdoc. But even, especially from the training grant from Keck, actually, I was highly interested in drug development. So that wasn't necessarily how I ended up in San Diego, but it wasn't a terrible thing either. And so you get an idea once you're in the middle of one of these clusters of just a lot of different opportunities. And so the ones that appeal to me kept popping up kind of time and again during that postdoc. Admittedly, I was a little bit comfortable, I'd say, at the postdoc stage. There was some success getting the postdoctoral fellowships, but at a certain point, you could kind of see the writing on the wall in terms of the next step, which is faculty, and all of the difficulties that are entailed with that, particularly the way the grant writing cutoff is just that much more competitive. And so I kind of had to make a choice of, it's going to take a lot of significant effort for me. Do I want to apply that effort to a research track faculty position, or do I want to apply it to the industry opportunities that I'm aware of and interested in? And at the end of the day, I think partially it was the fact of either staying in San Diego or going back home to Texas. That's one of the things that leaned me towards the industry aspect, because the academic opportunities I was seeing were kind of scattershot all over the country, suffice it to say, which is a real factor in these sorts of things. So once that came to mind, then it was, okay, how do I get my foot in the door? And it's showing the skills, not how I would normally describe them, say, for a conference talk or things like that, the academic projects I was working on, but how do these apply directly to the jobs I'm working with? And we discussed it previously, typically for industry companies, and especially so in the R&D setting, you kind of have to check off all the boxes. So because of that, it took me a while to get my foot in the door because that 4 out of 5 is basically not going to cut it. Once I now have that foot in the door, now it's thinking about next career path, and you can see, you know, a lot of techniques outside of the production of the biologics that I work with, again, going back to purification and the quality profiles that are so critical for clinical trial. And are you going to pass toxicology studies and things like that? You don't have an initial great idea, but once your foot is in the door, especially after a PhD, you're able to acquire that information much more rapidly than the average person. So it allows a lot more opportunities. It is a bit of an obstacle just to get over the first spot, though.
Okay, thank you guys. You guys have been so incredibly gracious sharing your expertise and your knowledge and your own personal journeys. So we're kind of hitting the home stretch now. We've got about 4 minutes. So I'm going to ask each of you to just for parting words, you know, what something maybe we haven't touched on yet, or something that you want to reinforce. Just, you know, go for it. So, Alan.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. A couple of the points that I'd like to reiterate are that I think that just taking some time and finding out what you're interested in and being true to that is probably the #1 priority. So work-life balance, you know, all these other things. I think the core is what you're interested in, because that's kind of to what other folks have said, what gets you out of bed every day and what will take you on your path forward, right? Because kind of your step you take right now is not going to be permanent, but it's going to somehow impact your path. You can change it later, right? But you can it's like an 80-20 thing. Once you select your right interest, you're going to get kind of closer to that right direction. And the second point I wanted to make has just left me. So maybe we can come back to me after I remember the second point.
Okay, Anna.
Yeah, I think I'm a true believer of the grass is greenest where you water it. I really am. And so just, you know, keeping that in mind, right? It's where you are now, but also where do you want to go and what are you going to do to get there and how you can change it. I think also self-reflection and just like consistently asking yourself, like, am I still happy? Do I still love what I'm doing? Am I still, you know, feeling the excitement, and to understand what are the things that drive you and maybe what are the things that you can delegate to someone else and go forth and conquer your next role. So trying and be aware of those, I think, helps in trying to understand what role in industry may be a good role for you. And then also remembering that you also need to set those boundaries that I talked about in terms of, you know, time commitments and things like that. And if there's any opportunities that you can to practice that or help, you know, start to set those boundaries, because I think it will become more important as you progress throughout your career, because there's always going to be that push wherever you are of doing more, giving more time, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah.
Thank you for reminding me about my point. So I think it's incredibly important to take care of your health. So exercise, things like that. Early in our career, we want to do our best at everything, but I think health is most valuable. It'll take you the furthest. And then also don't underestimate your PhD. You might think your research area is not exactly applicable to this particular job, but if you're interested in it, try it out, and then you can get feedback from that application process as well and continue to iterate. So hopefully that helps.
Mm-hmm. You guys stole all my answers around intrinsic reward system. That's always what I say. But yes, understand yourself. Do your homework about the companies that you're applying for. Do your homework about the jobs that you're applying for. Try to talk to anybody you can at conferences or people who come through your labs, and we are all just people. We're all just friends. And the network that you build now is the network that will take you throughout your entire career. The friends that I made in Houston through GCC, through MD Anderson, I am still calling them. We are still hiring each other and we have all dispersed, your friends are your biggest allies in this. So just continue to be vulnerable with people and don't be afraid to say you're looking for something and bounce those ideas off of people. Don't be afraid to ask for mentorship. Yeah, don't be afraid to reach out. So.
Yeah, sounds good. I guess the drawbacks of being last is that all of the things that have been mentioned are great ideas. I guess the benefit of going last is that you have time to think of a couple more. So I think just expounding on what everyone said is that self-awareness is good for this sort of stuff. To give a little extra detail on that, I think that there's definitely value for everyone to just take a little time, list the things that you're good at skill-wise and the things that motivate you. Those are not necessarily the same thing, but where there's overlap in those is going to help a ton with career path, and that goes for academia or industry. I think the second part, which is expanding really on what Alan said, is that I would suggest do not sell yourself short, and particularly that relates to skills, including the skills that you learn PhD or postdoc. Typically speaking, you think of when you're doing a research project, that's the main thing that you're working on, and skills you're gaining, for example, tend to be protocols and laboratory techniques that are directly related to that project. You're learning over a 4 to 7 year plus even period so much more than that, especially on the soft skills side. Probably the biggest thing, for example, for my postdoc that I'm taking currently, is describing complex technical data in a 1 or 2 sentence manner, because these clients are not necessarily scientifically inclined. So you have to make the implications very clear. That's not necessarily what you do a postdoc for, is learning how to speak very quickly, but it's one of many, many things that you pick up along the way. You just have to think about them.
Okay, this has just been a fantastic afternoon. Thank you so much for taking in some cases, your personal time, because some of you were off work a couple of hours ago, to share all of this information. And to those of you who stuck with us through an hour and a half, thank you for being here and for your wonderful questions. If you need to have a recording of this, please send us an email. We will not be posting this on a website. And if you have any follow-up questions for any of our panelists, feel free to contact them through LinkedIn. They have all agreed that that is the best way for you to contact them, and they'd be happy to answer your individual questions. Should you want to go that route. So thanks again, everyone. We can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Sarah, Alan, Cameron, and Anna. It was great to see you guys again too. Thank you again for your time today. Take care.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.